All right, welcome everybody. My name is Geoffrey Sigalet. I'm an assistant professor here at UBCO. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Professor Jacob Levy from McGill University. He is the chair of McGill's Political Science Department and the Tomlinson Professor of Political Theory. He's also the coordinator of McGill's Research Group for Constitutional Studies and the Groupe de Recherche Interuniversitaire en Philosophie Politique, or GRIP, as I called it when I was at McGill, and the director of the Yan P. Lin Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Modern and Ancient Worlds. He holds a PhD from Princeton University, an LLM from the University of Chicago, and he is a leading scholar in normative political theory, writing on multiculturalism and rationalism and pluralism, the history of political thought, specializing especially in the work of Adam Smith, and in legal and constitutional theory. His books include The Multiculturalism of Fear, Oxford University Press 2000, and Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom, Oxford University Press 2014. Some of my favorites amongst his published articles, and please indulge me in specifying a few of these, are his article Not So Novus in Ordo, which is an article about against contractarian ideas of constitutionalism, which was published in Political Theory in 2009. And his article, There is No Such Thing as Ideal Theory, which is published in Social Philosophy and Policy in 2016. He's also recently offered the University of Alberta's prestigious Macdonald Lecture, the 31st Macdonald Lecture, in Constitutional Studies, which was titled The Separation of Powers and the Challenge of Constitutional Democracy. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guest today.
Thank you to everyone for coming out, and thank you, Professor Sigalet, for that warm welcome. It's really a delight to see you here in your professorial capacity in your new scholarly home. I have known you for many, many years in a couple of different capacities, and it's been with a keen eye and interest that, along with other people in political theory, constitutional law, and legal theory, I've been watching the gradual unfolding and institutional development of what it is you're building here at UBCO, and it's delightful to come see it in person. The slightly awkward title of my talk, Culture War as a Teaching Moment on the Difference Between Academic Freedom and Freedom of Speech, is borrowed from the slightly awkward headline that a Globe and Mail editor attached to an essay of mine a few weeks ago. It is a little bit awkward, but mostly accurate, which is to say, as a disclaimer up front, I'm mostly not going to be talking about culture war issues. I am mostly going to be talking about the broader questions of university life, university structure, and university governance that I think have been highlighted by recent developments on campuses across North America. And toward the end of my remarks, I will turn to those very current questions and talk about the ways in which the principles I've built up can help us, I think, see new things about how to address them. I'm going to build the ideas up piece by piece. I'm going to start with the following proposition, which I will support later on. I hope that it's a little bit surprising at first and will not be surprising by half an hour or so from now. That proposition is that freedom of speech is not a fundamental virtue or principle of university life. That doesn't mean that there are not principles of freedom of speech that are relevant to university life, but freedom of speech is not, in the first instance, a principle of university life. It is a principle of liberal democratic society. It's a principle of constitutional law. It is not the governing rule about university life. The governing rule about university life is instead academic freedom. I'm going to build up piece by piece what academic freedom means, including, eventually, the kind of freedom of speech that is generated as a curious kind of side effect from principles of academic freedom. Side effect here is not derogatory. There are ways in which the freedom of speech that is generated by academic freedom is surprisingly absolute. but it's important to get straight what its foundation is. The first case of academic freedom, the central figure, the central problem, when we imagine a problem of academic freedom, is that of the individual researcher. An individual researcher protected by academic freedom has the freedom to follow their argument where it leads without an imposed orthodoxy as to conclusions. That no orthodoxy rule has what we'll start by characterizing as two different aspects. One aspect, and the one that maybe has the deepest roots in university life, is that there must not be an imposition of orthodoxy from within the scholarly community. A researcher must be free to build arguments and evidence that will change the scholarly mind about things. We must be free to find new things out. And finding new things out is upsetting to those who came before us in university life, who had done the work of building up the old view that the new view is going to upset. Academic freedom is, in important part, the freedom to challenge established scholarship in one's field of research. But the no orthodoxy rule has a second aspect as well. And that's that the conclusions that the researcher is free to reach must not be limited by extra scholarly, non-scholarly constraints on what conclusions the scholarship will support. This is in some ways a newer rule, really only fully developed and institutionalized in the research universities of Europe and North America around the turn of the 19th to the 20th centuries. There are roots that are older, but it became a central pillar, a central principle of academic freedom around the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries in research universities. The prohibition on orthodoxy there especially targets imposed orthodoxies as to religion and politics. The scholar who is doing research, developing arguments, building evidence, must be free in the university's terms, free to reach conclusions that are politically or religiously controversial or unpopular. Academic freedom as an institutional practice took a great deal of its shape in the defense of that principle, very often defending radical or dissenting kinds of political or religious conclusions from more conservative off-campus actors. And the task of the university as an institution in this case was to protect its professors from retaliation that ran through the university as an institution, where, for example, a state or provincial or national legislature or an off-campus donor would demand of the university that it fire the professor who has reached some unorthodox conclusion, some piece of research that tended to the support of, for example, atheism or communism. That's the key first step. The researcher having the freedom to follow their arguments and evidence where it leads in doing scholarly research. I will add here an addendum that I think helps make sense of the developed practice of academic freedom, but that is insufficiently recognized. And that's that principle protects all scholars in a university community, by which I mean it protects students. It is also true of student research. Clearly true of a PhD student doing a dissertation, making an original contribution to human knowledge. But I maintain that it is also true of the first-year undergraduate, when we treat the first-year undergraduate's in-class essay as an attempt at inquiry, trying to find answers. It is the case that that student's work, while it will be evaluated according to its conformity with the methods of inquiry, it will be tested against whether it shows mastery of what's been taught in the class. It may not be penalized simply for reaching either a novel conclusion relative to established scholarship, nor for reaching a conclusion that is politically or religiously unorthodox. We don't see cases like this as much, but as I will get to, we see other kinds of cases in which the inclusion of students really does matter. Now, the immunity from orthodoxy is not an immunity from evaluation. Academic freedom is not a generic right to be able to just write and say whatever you want, call it scholarship, and get good grades if you're a student, get a PhD awarded to you if you're a graduate student, get hired for an academic job, get tenure, get promoted to full professor. All of those things require scholarship. And scholarship is understood with reference to the methods of inquiry and standards of evidence that are appropriate to each local scholarly community. Most often, and I will use this for shorthand here, disciplines. You have to do work according to the scholarly rules of a discipline. Those scholarly rules vary a great deal across a university. What counts as valid inquiry, what counts as the standards of evidence, is very different in a physics lab from what it is in a comparative literature classroom. But each of them has standards of argument and evidence that must be met. What this means is that academic freedom, despite having as its paradigmatic case in our imagination the individual researcher, is in an important way an associational freedom, a collective self-governance freedom of those academic units. It's an associational freedom that comes with a promise to the individual researcher. The freedom is, we around here, we physicists, we comparative literature scholars, we political theorists, we law professors, we are the ones who are the custodians around here on our campus of the norms of inquiry, the standards of evaluation that belong to our discipline. Again, discipline here is a shorthand. There are interdisciplinary communities of research and so on. We are the custodians and the enforcers of those standards of evaluation. What we promise to the individual researcher, be that a full professor or a first-year undergraduate, is that in your status as a scholar, in your scholarly work, you will be evaluated according to those standards of inquiry, argument, and evidence, not evaluated with respect to an orthodoxy of conclusion. Again, whether that orthodoxy of conclusion is the settled received wisdom within the discipline or the political or religious popularity of the view. Academic freedom is a complicated and nested kind of associational freedom. The individual department or institute or center is in some important ways the key bearer of academic freedom. When an individual scholar, professor or undergraduate or whatever, gets caught committing research fraud or plagiarism, lying about what it is their evidence found. I made up this text from the archives that I claim I consulted. I falsified the evidence of my pharmaceutical lab experiment. When we do those things, we are absolutely subject to the most stringent disciplines that the university community has to offer. Notice here the difference with freedom of speech. Freedom of speech in a liberal democratic community includes the freedom to lie. There are certain carefully delimited exceptions. It does not include the freedom to commit certain kinds of fraud on a consumer that endanger the consumer's health, and it does not include the freedom to lie in a way that is damaging to another person's reputation, that's defamation. But in a general way, it absolutely includes the freedom to lie. One of the freedoms to lie that it includes is the freedom to hire a ghostwriter. Academic freedom does not include the freedom to hire someone else to write your papers or your books for you. The gap there is fundamental. What we are doing in a university is protecting those communities of inquiry and the integrity of those communities of inquiry on the belief that orthodoxy of any kind is incompatible with the intellectual enterprise of the university, that is the discovery, the passing on, and the preservation of knowledge and inquiry. The norms that are appropriate to each discipline or center or department or institute then become the key thing about academic life at a university. Now, I've kept emphasizing that the researcher is protected from an orthodoxy in the conclusions of their research. But now we reach some kind of odd new consequences of the view. One of the ways in which is really important and valuable for universities to credibly commit to their whole community that no one is going to be limited in their inquiry based on an orthodoxy is that the university not have orthodoxies. This is not a strictly logical requirement, but it's almost impossible to make the commitment credible to the whole intellectual community if it's the case that the university stands out there and says, in this university, we believe that the correct interpretation of the following provision of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or the nature of the Trinity of God, or whatever. If the university says, this is the university's view, but really everyone's free to do their own thing, it's hard to make it credible. And the likelihood that there will be a chilling effect on inquiry is consistently, and I think rightly taken, to mean that academic freedom is impinged when universities embrace an orthodoxy, because the members of the scholarly community have good reason to believe that their freedom to inquire is going to be limited. A rule against orthodoxy is not only a rule against official university declarations. It is also a rule against singling out particular conclusions in non-academic speech for punishment or retaliation. The technical word for this technical phrase for this doctrine that I'm about to explain is freedom of extramural speech. Outside the walls of the three core academic spaces, which are the laboratory, the library, and the classroom. Speech outside the walls, extramural, is protected by academic freedom in a way that very closely resembles freedom of speech. Why? Because the alternative is that, say, the mathematician who goes out into the world and espouses atheism or communism or what have you, is then again subject to the pressure for retaliation, whether by the university administration that itself dislikes the view, or by the off-campus actors who want to instrumentalize the university to penalize the view. This is a strange outcome. Really want to emphasize it as a strange outcome. It means that freedom of extramural speech, what we do in our capacity not as scholars, not when we are obeying the standards of evidence and argumentation appropriate to our discipline, But when we're just talking, or protesting, or tweeting, that speech has a kind of absolute protection. It's not subject to evaluation by the standards of argument and evidence. It's not scholarship. Some people look at that fact and say, therefore, academic freedom doesn't protect this stupid stuff that you say at a protest, in a letter to the editor, on Twitter. But in order for the university to retaliate against you in your capacity as a scholar, that is to say, to threaten to fire a professor, to penalize the grade or threaten the status as an enrolled student of a student, to strip someone of a department chair or a center directorship, any of the tools that a university has at its disposal, which are, after all, not throwing people in jail, but are only limitations on our academic standing. Those tools, those punishments limiting our academic standing, must not be used against us for our extramural speech, because to do so is for the university to impose an orthodoxy. An orthodoxy that is almost always about the political or religious unpopularity of the view that we're espousing. It's a strange outcome. We are more protected, we are more absolutely protected by academic freedom when we're behaving least like academics than we are when we're behaving most like academics. But it is a long-established principle of academic freedom. It was part of the development of the doctrine over the course of those decades in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, over some of the same cases that I've already been talking about. Because it is not only the theologian who your local conservative religious donor base is worried about. It is very much the mathematician or the physicist who goes out and espouses atheism in their spare time. And in order to protect that person's tenure, in order to protect that person's academic employment, academic freedom as a practice came to articulate a very sharp absolute protection of freedom of extramural speech. I said at the beginning, we were going to get to a principle of freedom of speech, but it was going to be a strange kind of side effect. What we're seeing here is not universities saying, we really value you saying stupid things on Twitter in the way that we really value your research and your teaching or the book collection in the library. It is rather, that is so irrelevant to the scholarly mission that we are not going to take any official notice of it whatsoever. Therefore, from the perspective of the university, what you say out of the walls is between you and your audience. Now, this does not guarantee that there aren't going to be any other social actors that impinge on you. The university protects academic freedom against outside actors with respect to research and teaching and libraries. It's a violation of academic freedom for the provincial government or the national government to tell you, you may not teach gender studies, you may not teach critical race theory, you may not have books in your library that call into question the greatness of our nation. It's not a violation of academic freedom if in my extramural speech I violate the hate speech law of the jurisdiction I happen to be in and the civil government comes after me for that. The university does not have an obligation to protect me from that. But the university should not be the one to punish me. The state should. A complicated, nested associational freedom exercised by individuals for the protection of the integrity of the academic mission that has the side effect of generating an absolute prohibition on university-imposed orthodoxies about our extramural speech. Now we're going to reach the current day. It is a difficult discipline not in our academic sense, but in the ordinary sense. It is a difficult discipline for universities to follow the no orthodoxy rule. Often, university leadership is not made up of academics who have come up through the academic ranks, or if they are, then it is a selection of those academics who've come up through the academic ranks, but also have a way of successfully navigating the currents having to do with relationships with governments or donors or both of the above. University leadership, like leadership of any large organization, has a desire to do and say that which is politically popular. And it's good that they have that urge. We do want the leadership of universities to do some of the work that we professors don't want to have to do, of keeping outside actors happy and on board. The university is in some ways a very fragile institution, and it does rely on the rest of society. We do need to have leaders who are willing to do the work of explaining to, justifying, and defending what we do to the rest of the community. University leadership also, of course, wants to keep the peace internally. They want to say things that will be popular and pleasing to a sufficiently large proportion of the university community itself to keep things running more smoothly. It is easier to govern a happy community than an unhappy community. But this means that the temptation is always there for university leadership to make political statements that amount to the creation of a new orthodoxy. These are often not well thought out, often not developed over any very long period of time, often responses to the immediate news of the day, sometimes responses to either very sharp demands, either from outside the university community or from within it, or both. That you should say something on all our behalf. Over the last decade or so, I think it is probably the case that universities have slipped from expressions of sympathy, empathy, and a standing with, the kind of thing that we associate, for example, with natural disasters. It doesn't seem like the imposition of an orthodoxy for the university media office to send out a press release that says, our hearts go out to the victims of the earthquake. And we know that our student body from around the world has relatives at home in this city on the other side of the world who have suffered and potentially died in the earthquake. Our hearts go out to them. It seems like a natural next step to say, our hearts go out to the victims of this injustice. And there are characteristically on-campus actors who will say to the university, you need to say something like that. You're expressing your sorrow and your sympathy for all these other things that we can't do anything about. You are a powerful social institution. You can't fix the earthquake, but you can stand against injustice. Those stands against injustice have been developing an increasing habit of university statements on political questions that amount to the universities adopting political positions. The world of academic freedom I've been describing is not a world of political neutrality on campus. It is a world in which the work of political criticism, social commentary, analyses of justice and injustice are done by scholars. The university is the host of the social criticism. It is not itself the social critic. This slippage into universities increasingly taking stands that were very widely popular on university campuses, standing against various kinds of injustice, is one of the sources of the grave difficulties universities have had navigating the waters of the post-October 7th environment in their engagement with questions about the conflict in Israel and Gaza. There are problems, I think, on both sides here. In the first instance, in the wake of the attacks of October 7th, Jewish students and faculty, some, but by no means all of whom, had direct family connections to Israel, and non-Jewish students and faculty who stood with Israel in its horrified reaction to the campaign of terrorism and murder, said, universities now issue statements like this all the time. The university should issue a statement standing in solidarity with the victims of murder and terrorism. It's also the case that in this particular example, there are some significant off-campus actors who universities don't view as hostile. That is to say, there's a lot of pressure from alumni and trustees in a way that has not been the case for a lot of what's happened over the previous decade. That is to say, universities that adopted symbolic statements of solidarity with progressive movements over the last decade mostly did not have trustees or alumni who were going to give the university a hard time about this. Here, in the first moment, it had alumni and trustee support for this demand from Jewish and non-Jewish students and faculty. You should say something. Universities have also slipped into habits of increasing orthodoxy in the shape of penalizing what they characterize to be uncivil speech, inflammatory speech, or hate speech. And so in those first moments, not only did the universities come under pressure to say something solidaristic with Israel, but also to take direct action against pro-Palestinian students and or faculty, more often students, whose statements in extramural contexts, whose protests or posters or flyers or tweets looked like they were endorsements in one way or another of violence. Now, no community can survive a free-for-all with respect to actual violence from one member against another, nor, I think, with actual threats. But universities have gotten into a habit of thinking that what counted as violent speech was very much more than an actual threat against an unidentifiable person. It was rather the endorsement of a political view that seemed to have violent consequences some long way downstream. In this moment, that became a reason to sharply limit the freedom of extramural speech of those in support of Gaza and Palestine when their statements could be interpreted as endorsements of the violence of October 7th, or could be interpreted, and this is something that developed more over the weeks that followed, as calls for the end of the Jewish state of Israel, calls for the removal of the Jewish population from Israel, calls that increasingly came to be characterized as genocidal. Universities got caught up in a seriously inappropriate dispute over the question, is the phrase "from the river to the sea" a genocidal slogan? Now, many of you will have views on this. I have views on this. The university has no business having a view on this. The habit of thinking, well, the first thing we need to do is figure out whether this speech is kind of indirectly violent so that we can limit it, meant that supporters of the Palestinian cause got immediately the sharp end of limitations on freedom of extramural speech that are violations of the principles that I've been talking about. At the same time, some university leaders, many university leaders, did not immediately issue statements of the sort that those who wanted to stand with Israel were looking for. And so in the weeks and months after October 7th, in my view, both those whose sympathies lay with Israel and those whose sympathies lay with Gaza and Palestine rightly felt that the university was doing wrong by them. In the first case, because we've gotten in the habit of the university shutting down violent speech and issuing statements of solidaristic sympathy that are something more than anodyne, and many universities weren't doing those things with respect to the actual violence against Jewish civilians on October 7th. And those who were protesting the increasingly violent Israeli response in Gaza rightly said that their freedom of extramural speech was being more and more sharply limited. Film festivals were closed down, teachers and TAs were fired or removed from the classroom, protests were denied permits, the slogans and posters associated with protests were treated as reasons to actually penalize those members of the university community who were making those speeches or writing those posters or what have you. We've gotten ourselves into a bad place by neglecting the rules of academic freedom and the constraints and the discipline that they demand. We've created a campus climate in which, as soon as it's the case that we have real division on campus, as soon as we're out of the context of Black Lives Matter, where everyone on campus will just happily say, yes, of course, we're all on the same side. As soon as we face genuine division, we no longer have governing principles that we know how to live with in the context of that disagreement. And so there has been genuine, I think, appropriate disappointment, at best with hypocrisy and at worst with actual violations of academic freedom across the board in the North American university context in the weeks and months since October 7th. The headline attached to the talk that this is a teachable moment is not meant to downplay the actual moral and political seriousness of the moment. But I don't have expertise to offer on what it is to do in the Middle East. I do, I think, have some expertise to offer about the principles that govern university life and the ways in which departing from them has made it very much more difficult to live appropriately in communities of inquiry that are, after all, not themselves activist or advocacy communities. That's not what we are for as institutions, though we host people. And we, in our individual capacities, are people who are activists and advocates and social critics and reformers. But if we want to be able to be the kind of institution that can host people who are those things in different directions at the same time, then we need, I think, to take advantage of the teachable moment and recall the principles of academic freedom that constitute university life. Thank you.
Well, I hope you'll agree that that was a fantastic lecture. Thank you very much. My first question is about some of these. It seems to me that it's not just the kinds of social movements that the university has been pushed to side with to have maybe constitute some attempts at PR orthodoxy, but also attempts to shift the university's mission to include other missions alongside truth-seeking, such as pursuing social justice and whatnot, in a kind of substantive way, saying research should be aligned with some of these other commitments. And I'm just wondering to what extent you think that also may be playing a role here.
It plays a role, but to talking about to what extent is going to have a lot of variation across institutions, and I want to tread carefully here. There are many scholarly communities on university campuses that have intellectual orientations around, for example, studying the sources, the origins, the shape, and the effects of racial hierarchy or gender hierarchy. That's an academic community protected by academic freedom. And many of the gravest threats to academic freedom in the contemporary world come from off-campus government actors who are attacking the freedom of those research communities to pursue their research and teaching on those questions. So I don't in any way want to cede the idea that the fact that there are people on campus in their freely associating academic communities doing that work is one of the sources of departure from the principles of academic freedom. That is one of the instances of academic freedom. It can be the case that there's a spillover demand, that what we should be seeing is not the existence of centers or programs or departments that study one or another kind of unjust social hierarchy, but a demand that the university as a whole ought to be a reformist social actor seeking to undermine those hierarchies. And I think that's a tremendous difference. I think that many of the bad faith off-campus actors have no interest in that difference, and they are indeed willing to use the charge that the university as a whole has become woke or progressive or activist in order to aim at the destruction of those academic communities within the university. But there's something to it. There's something to the concern, much more so at some universities. I think not very much across the whole university sector, but undoubtedly at some universities where there's been really a demand to make the university take the side. There's something, I think, generationally funny here. Insofar as those demands come from students, there's something a little bit odd in the last decade and a half. For student protesters to be, as it were, unwilling to be oppositional, to demand that as one of what it is they're seeking from their protest, that the university endorse the content of their protest. This is not something we associate with, say, the 1960s student movements against the Vietnam War, in which, of course, everyone understood that the University of California system was part of the overall institutional structure of the American state, and they were protesting against that overall structure. They were not demanding the university must take a side and call for the end of the war. The students were themselves doing the protesting, calling for the war. They weren't looking for the university to do that for them or in their name. There has been a little bit of a drift that I have some trouble understanding in the idea of what it is to do protesting. I keep saying that the social commentary, social criticism enterprise is not the university's enterprise. And yet, it's been true for 1,000 years that when you bring together 20-year-olds, 20, 21, 22-year-olds, who have more time than their parents who are raising families, fill their heads with lots of interesting and exciting new ideas, giving them a wider view on the world than they've had before, and put them in conversation with each other, you get protests. This is a feature of university life. This is a feature of what it's like to be 20 and in an exciting new intellectual environment, hearing new ideas, and not having all of the responsibilities of job and family. You get big student movements happening. And I think we should be happy to acknowledge that that is a feature of university life, while still saying it's not the purpose of university life. Universities should not be aiming to destroy or shut down that fact, but neither should the universities subordinate themselves to the particular demands of a particular moment in what is, after all, the permanent structure of what it's like to have this generational shape of a community.
Okay, on that note, I just can't help but ask this. One of my favorite courses I took with you was medieval political theory, and the idea of the modern idea of the university is very different than the medieval university. But is there some of this in the Middle Ages in the early universities? I mean, I remember reading about the mendicant preachers and Aquinas getting pressure from the non-mendicant faculty at the University of Paris, right? Is this something that we just see in every university context?
Yes, I mean, fundamentally, yes. The medieval university was a separated, walled-off community. It was a separated, walled-off community even from the broader medieval city, which was itself a separated, walled-off community that kept at bay some of the politics and political conflicts of the wider world of feudalism. The university was foundationally, I say this in a tongue-in-cheek but sincere way, the university was foundationally a safe space. It was a safe space from any number of kinds of off-campus actors seeking to tell the people within the defined community what to think, what to study, what to teach. The medieval university was not a research university, and the medieval university was not as resolutely outside Christian orthodoxy as the modern university is. However, it is the case that the religious ferment of the Middle Ages within Catholicism had a great deal to do with the freedom of inquiry and teaching within theologies of faculty that would bring, say, your local professor of theology into real conflict with the bishop of the city. And the rule of the university is the bishop of the city does not get to tell the university to fire its professor of theology. That feature absolutely is central. The addition of research and the real subtraction of an official institutional connection to Christianity, those are big changes toward the end of the 19th century, but we are tracing recognizably continuous institutional practices over the 1,000-year existence of the university.
That answer was everything I hoped for. The other question I have is, to what extent is the lack of or maybe threat to viewpoint diversity on campuses? So I think there was a recent MLI study that showed that 9% of Canadian professors vote for conservative parties, or maybe just admit to. To what extent does that lack of viewpoint diversity, or political viewpoint diversity at least on campus, help make it more difficult to maintain the institutional neutrality you think as part of academic freedom?
My answers keep being, it's complicated. It's complicated. Two complications to start with about why I dislike reliance on those kinds of studies. One is that the partisan spread of the surrounding society is far from being the only relevant measure of whether there is a diversity of political and ideological opinions on campus. It might be one thing that we want to know, but it's really wrong to look at the outcome that says only 9% of tenure-track faculty vote conservative and say, aha, the campus is an ideological monoculture. Campus is not an ideological monoculture. Campus is characterized by very deep, ongoing, constant political and social and ideological dispute and inquiry. That there's one faction of political opinion that is very much more popular in the surrounding society than it is on campus. It can have different causes in different societies and at different times. The other is that I think there's a great deal that can be done with credible commitment to the rules of university life to protect the freedom to dissent. So what people rely on those studies for is to say, if I am a conservative professor or a conservative student on campus, I am likely to self-censor because I think that I'm encountering a conformist intellectual culture. It can be true. Intellectual cultures are different from official rules, and in all kinds of ways, all kinds of social settings, conformism is one of the features of human associational life. It can be less so in universities than in most other social institutions. We live in societies in which communities of worship, say, are really centrally organized around a kind of conformity. We increasingly in Canada and the United States live in cities and neighborhoods and regions that are overall politically polarized. We increasingly either live in places and live in social spheres where we know no one who ever served in the armed forces, or we know all of our friends and family who have someone who served in the armed forces. Conformity is a fact. And universities aren't immune to this social fact, and overwhelming majorities can engender conformity. But universities have some tools at their disposal that those other institutions don't have, which is the serious, repeated, credible commitment that here there's not an orthodoxy. This is one of my pet causes. We orient new students at universities about all kinds of things. And this is not one of them. The principles of academic freedom, whether at the level of complexity that I'm describing or in the much simpler level that we find in, say, an official doctrinal statement, either from the universities, and many of our universities do actually have one paragraph statements of academic freedom, or something like the official statements from the CAUT, we don't do anything to explain to students that this is what a university community is like. And one of the things that means is that you are absolutely protected as a student from punishment for dissent. I said early on that there were some cases where I thought it really, really mattered to take seriously that students are protected by academic freedom. One of the ways in which I think it really, really matters is to reassure students that their politically unpopular views will never be held against them in an academic context. Whether their politically unpopular views are what they reach in the conclusion of their essay. I teach political theory classes, and so my students are writing on questions of justice and injustice, and I put right on my syllabus, and I say on the first day, I'm evaluating you on the quality of your argument, not on the political content of your conclusion, and that they're immune from retaliation for their extramural speech. Students go out and say inflammatory things at protests. It turns out that 19 and 20-year-olds can get really excited about things sometimes. And I promise them, it doesn't matter what you say at a protest. It is irrelevant to how I am going to evaluate you in the class. I think that we can do things to affect the tendency toward conformity and the tendency toward self-censorship and the tendency to suppression by actually acknowledging the promises that we're supposed to be bound by. That's not the same as reassuring a student, if you say something politically unpopular, you might be unpopular. That your friends and your dorm mates and your peers are going to evaluate you socially and morally. Yes, they're going to, and that's their right, and there is plenty of conformity that can result from that. But universities do have tools at their disposal to talk about what the overall climate of debate and disagreement and inquiry is like that I think we're not using enough.
I mean, certainly true. I don't remember hearing about academic freedom as an undergrad. My last question before we turn it over is about what practically and straightforwardly should universities respond with when they're asked to condemn certain points of view, whether it's the views of faculty or students or staff maybe?
Why, thank you, Professor Sigalet. It turns out that I have a model statement.
I thought you might.
The model statement, which I believe university media offices need to have as a shortcut on their keyboards, is the university does not take stands on contested political questions. And in not taking stands, that means it does not either endorse or criticize the particular speech of members of its scholarly community. The university endorses the academic freedom that protects all of its members in their extramural speech. The university is not going to say anything else about that, and the standing rule is that our silence about this thing that a professor said in an op-ed is neither a tacit endorsement nor a tacit criticism, and the more often you say it, the truer it becomes. The difficulty is if you're in the habit of issuing denunciations and then all of a sudden you remember the rule. And there have been some cases of this in the last couple months, where universities that seemed to have forgotten the rules suddenly remembered them, and the onlookers in the audience said, "Oh, come on. We know you don't refrain from comment. Let me read you the list of all the comments you've made over the last 5 years. You need to keep to the doctrine, but there are ways to keep to it that constantly reaffirm the value of the principle. These demands for institutional neutrality, they're not something to apologize for. We saw the leaders of 3 American universities trying and failing to defend the right principles before a hostile US House committee. Trying and failing because they were apologizing for them. Trying and failing because they were unable to articulate the reasons for a general university rule that says, no, we do not single out particular protesters and expel them for what they've put on a poster. We never do that because that's not what academic freedom consists of. Instead, they fell back on a kind of lawyerly apology about it.
Is your sense that they partly took a lot of heat for that because the Republicans in the House could exploit, or seem to be almost exploiting the fact that the audience knows that some of those administrators might not have stuck to those principles always in the past? Or even that there's that perception of it?
Yeah, I mean, that moment was playing to a lot of different audiences. And I think it's the case that the hostile reaction to the university president's performances from campus and campus-adjacent actors, that is to say from faculty and trustees, that had a lot to do with that. I think that what happened actually in the House chamber was a simpler kind of demagoguery, and
right.
You need to go into a setting like that prepared for what that environment is actually going to be like.
Political demagoguery.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I didn't mention this in my introduction, and you mentioned this, but I was your student, and I'm so grateful to have been your student, and all the more so tonight having you here. So join me in thanking him one more time for coming and speaking with us.